thanks for joining me for this edition of the Author's Corner, brought to you by KNEO 91.7 FM The Word. I'm Roberta Foster, and today I welcome Roland C. Warren to Author's Corner. He's written the book, The Alternative to Abortion, Why We Must Be Pro-Abundant Life, which is published by CareNet, and he'll tell you more about how to find the book at the end of the program. Let me share a little bit about Roland. He's a graduate of Princeton University and the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. He is an inspirational servant leader with a heart for Christ and a mind for business. After 20 years in the corporate world, he spent 11 years as president of the National Fatherhood Initiative before joining CareNet in 2012 as president and CEO. Roland, thank you so much for joining us today on Author's Corner.
Delighted to be with you. Thanks so much for your interest.
The title of the book mentions why we must be pro-abundant life. Tell us what the difference is between that and just calling ourselves pro-life.
Yeah, great question. Well, the notion of being pro-abundant life is actually based on John 10:10, where Christ said, I came that you might have life and then have that life abundantly. So this is Jesus' why statement. And when you look at that passage in the Greek, he's talking about two types of life. He's talking about physical life, where we have the Greek word bios, B-I-O-S, where we get the word biology, if you will, physical life. But he's also talking about Zoe, which is a unique type of spiritual life that only comes from a relationship with God. And so what he's essentially saying in this verse is, I came to link your bios to my Zoe, that you might be heartbeats that are heaven-bound. And so when I started to think about kind of what we're doing as Christians around the life issue, you can be an atheist and be pro-life.
Right.
But you can't be an atheist and be pro-abundant life because you're not solving for heartbeats that are heaven-bound. And so God sort of gave me this perspective, and I started to talk about it because I really think this is an aspect of kind of what we're doing in terms of the life issue that really needs to be thought through in a different way and frankly, framed in a different way to really anchor it in Jesus' why statement, why he came. And so that's really kind of the notion.
Well, we know that to the dismay of many Christians who are part of the Republican Party, they watered down the whole pro-life issue in their platform this last election. Did that have some inspiration for changing the direction from pro-life to pro-abundant life?
Well, actually, not really. I mean, I started talking about this in 2013. If you go back and look at CareNet, we're a pro-abundant life ministry, and that's when really God sort of gave me that framework. And here's the practical thing. I'm not, I'm disappointed by what's happened politically, but I'm not surprised because what's happened is that the term pro-life really has become a political term in the sense that, one person says I'm pro-life, and why? Because I believe that the circumstances of a child's conception and birth should not determine its humanity and worth. So whether you're conceived in love or lust, wanted, unwanted, seen to abnormalities, no matter what it is, you still have, intrinsic value because you're created in the image of God, Imago Dei. And another person says, well, I'm pro-life too. Okay, what about you? Well, I'm for a 15-week ban. Okay, well, how many abortions happen before 15 weeks? 96%. That's considered pro-life. That's a pro-life position. And then what about you? Well, I'm for a 20-week ban because we think, kids in the womb can feel pain at that point. Well, 99% of abortions happen before 20 weeks, according to the CDC. So what's happened is we took a term that has an absolute, that's an immutable, if you will, and we give it to a political process. And politics is all about splitting things. Right? That's the notion of politics. I got a conviction, you have a conviction, we come together, we make a compromise. In other words, each one of us has to abandon aspects of our conviction. That works well if you're talking about roads or buildings or all kinds of other things, right? But when you're talking about something that can't be split, like you can't split the baby, then you take your issue and you give it to a political process. You shouldn't be surprised when it gets split. And that's exactly what happened. So I think, candidly, God sort of gave me this perspective to start communicating in anticipation of this moment, not because of this moment, that hopefully, like the movie Matrix, we can be unplugged to see, wait a minute, we really need to anchor our response firmly in the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so the pro-abundant life perspective really lays that out, and I talk about that in great detail in my book.
And you've mentioned CareNet, and we know that you are currently the CEO of CareNet. We happen to have a CareNet facility right here in Neosho where this radio station is at, and so we know a little bit about it, but on the other hand, many other people may not. So give us a little insight into what CareNet is about.
Sure, absolutely. Great ministry, started 50 years ago. It's our 50th anniversary, started by Francis Schaeffer, C. Everett Koop, and Billy Graham was involved as well, and a theologian named Harold O.J. Brown, and really started to really try to help engage, folks around the life issue. It was first called the Christian Action Council, and then became called CareNet, to help the network of pregnancy centers to start growing and support them. So now we have about over 1,200 pregnancy centers in the U.S. and Canada that are designed to offer compassion, hope, help to anyone who's facing a pregnancy decision. So we help that network grow. We have a national 800 number or hotline, if you will, for women and men facing pregnancy decisions. We have a robust mobile ministry. We just integrated another ministry into CareNet called ICU Mobile. So now we have mobile medical units going into communities for women and men facing pregnancy decisions to give them free ultrasounds and help them make life decisions. And then we have a connection to the church through our Making Life Disciples ministry, which is designed to move people from inspiration to action. In other words, to help them see the life issue primarily through the lens of discipleship. And so the two pillars of a pro-abundant life perspective that we support is God's design for family and then God's call to discipleship. Those two pillars are what hold up a pro-abundant life roof. And when you build strong families, guess what happens? You have less abortion. And when those families become disciples of Jesus Christ, guess what happens? You have less abortion. So that's how you end up with Bias and Zoe. 87% of the women that have abortions are unmarried. So you're not going to solve the abortion issue without also focusing on the sanctity of marriage and family. And the political narrative delinked that. It only focused on saving the baby, if you will, and maybe helping the woman. But when you look at the biblical narrative, and the best example is the birth of Christ, where Mary was facing an unplanned pregnancy from a human perspective. What did God do? He didn't give her a baby daddy and a check or a social worker and a check. He called Joseph to be a husband to her and a father to the child growing inside of her. In other words, to be disciples who make disciples who live and love like Jesus. And so a pro-abundant life perspective anchors this work in the nativity narrative of the birth of Christ, because that's what we're called to do. These proverbial Marys that are facing pregnancy decisions. The way they got pregnant is very different, but the consequence is exactly the same. And God didn't just send an angel to Mary, he also sent one to Joseph, called him to be a husband to her and a father to the child growing inside of her. And for her not to sacrifice that life, but to see that the life growing inside of her is a life worth sacrificing. So I hope you can see that's very different from how people talk about, quote, pro-life.
Yes.
What I'm talking about is really anchored in the gospel of Jesus Christ, living out the great commandment, if you will, because the child in the womb is a neighbor, and to fulfill the Great Commission, because the child in the womb is a neighbor who needs to become a disciple of Jesus Christ, just like the woman and just like the man who got her pregnant. So it's a holistic, gospel-centered, focused way of looking at the life issues. It's actually anchored in the birth of Christ, which is in the first chapter of the first book of the New Testament, and then anchored in the last chapter of the first book of the New Testament, which is where Jesus gives us that command to what? Go and make disciples. And I think once Christians start seeing the life issue primarily, not as a political issue with some material support needs and some political engagement perspective, but that it's primarily a living out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission in this context, then the church leads rather than following. Right now the church is following the politics. The church is supposed to be leading, and then the political support and material support engagement, those things are part of that process, but the church must lead, and the church will only lead if we see it as a Great Commandment, Great Commission issue, which is the call of the Church of Jesus Christ.
Amen. Well, we're going to delve into that just a little bit more in just a moment. I'm talking to Roland C. Warren regarding his book, The Alternative to Abortion, Why We Must Be Pro-Abundant Life, and it's published by CareNet. You're listening to Author's Corner, and I'm Roberta Foster. So aside from the pastor sharing about the fact that abortion is killing the life of a baby, what else should the church be involved in doing to promote this pro-abundant life theology?
Yeah, well, absolutely. It's anchored in the birth of Christ, and it's anchored in the work of the church, which is making disciples. And so a key ministry outreach that we have is called Making Life Disciples. And the goal of Making Life Disciples is to get small groups in the church to come alongside and support a woman a couple that are facing pregnancy decisions.
Okay.
We have so many folks in the church. 54% of the women that have abortions profess to be either Catholic or Protestant. They're in the pews on Sunday, in the abortion clinic on Monday. But the reality is that most churches don't have a ministry on-ramp for that person, so that if a woman wakes up Sunday morning and takes a pregnancy test, and the test is positive, but she thinks the news is negative, what ministry is she supposed to talk to in her church? So when you have these small groups in the church that say, no, we're going to walk alongside this sister, we're going to walk alongside this brother, we're going to walk alongside this couple to help them build a strong, God-honoring family, and to help that family become disciples of Jesus Christ. We have so many small groups in the church, but too often our small groups are about us loving us. What if our small group got trained and became about us loving them? What if we then had an army of people surrounding those facing pregnancy decisions inside and outside the church? That woman at the pregnancy center who's getting support from conception to birth, she has a ministry in the church that's going to walk alongside her. And here's the point. Even if she makes the abortion decision, we're still called to what? Love her. Peter aborted Jesus because an abortion is a rejection of life, which Peter did. So what did Jesus do? He said, well, I guess I'm done with that. Peter thought he was, but what did Jesus do? He restored him. Well, that's the role of the church. So we also have a very robust post-abortion ministry called Forgiven and Set Free for women and Reclaiming Fatherhood for men. So these are the kinds of ministry things that should be led by the church. This issue is the church's issue, and the church must lead. And when the church starts to lead on this issue, then we'll see the transformation, not only in our pews, but also in the public, and frankly, you'll see the transformation even in the polls. Because if you lose the pews and you lose the pastors, you lose the polls, and that's exactly what we've seen here. So this is really a call to go back and viewing this issue primarily as a Great Commandment, Great Commission issue, God's design for family, and then God's call to discipleship. That's the role of the church.
Amen. Well, today the book that we're talking about is called The Alternative to Abortion, Why We Must Be Pro-Abundant Life, and it's published by CareNet. So, Roland, tell our listeners how they can find out more about this book and what CareNet's access internet-wise is.
Okay, absolutely. You can find the book on Amazon, where pretty much all the books are sold. So you go on Amazon and you can find it there. You can visit CareNet's site at care-net.org. So care-net.org. If you're interested in Making Life Disciples, you can go to makinglifedisciples.com to learn about that ministry platform. Our abortion recovery is abortionhealing.org. So, again, all those different vehicles to get to us. But if you want to make it simple, buy the book at Amazon and then come to CareNet's site, care-net.org, and you can learn more about the amazing work that God has called us to do and that the church is making possible.
And since we have just a moment longer, one of the things you've been talking about is actually the involvement of men in discipling them as well. And it's been a couple of years now, but it seems like it's relatively new, at least to our area here, about having classes to teach men how to be fathers.
Absolutely. That's a central part of a pro-abundant life perspective because of God's design for family, and you don't have families in God's economy without men, and calling those men to be husbands and to fathers. And really, we model our work after what God did for Joseph. Like, he sent an angel to Joseph with a very specific call. And here's the thing. The first thing he told Joseph was, what? Protect the Christ child? In other words, the sanctity of life? No. The first thing he told him was, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife. In other words, within the abortion issue is the sanctity of marriage and family and the sanctity of life. And we've done a number of studies, and what we found was that the man who got her pregnant is the most influential in her abortion decision. We did a national survey with Lifeway. We surveyed women who had abortions, and we asked them who was the most influential. She said the guy. And then we surveyed guys who had participated in abortion, and we asked them who was the most influential, and they said I was. So here we have the guy being the most influential, and so much of the pro-life response has been about helping the woman and saving the baby, but not reaching the guy. And he's the most influential in that decision. And I'll just give you this last piece. The reason I know that is because I lived it. When I was a 20-year-old college student at Princeton, I got my girlfriend pregnant. And for the first 5 months, no one knew about her pregnancy except me. You think I had an impact? And by the grace of God, guess what we did? We got married. In other words, I had to tap into my inner Joseph to be a husband to her and a father to the child growing inside of her, and she had to tap into her inner Mary to basically, like Mary, say, let it be on to me, as you have said, and guess what? We formed a family. So we had an unplanned pregnancy, but we didn't have a crisis pregnancy because we formed a family. And that's really the call of a pro-abundant life approach.
Amen. Well, thank you for that personal testimony and making it such a real example for our listeners today, and for talking with me about your book, The Alternative to Abortion, Why We Must Be Pro-Abundant Life. It's written by Roland C. Warren and published by CareNet, and he gave you the contact information on that earlier. And so, Roland, thank you so much for being with us on Author's Corner.
Blessing to be with you. Thanks so much for your interest. Take care.
And to our listeners, if you'd like to hear this interview again, or this is a great one to share it with other people, you can find it on your favorite podcast platform or through kneo.org. So thank you for tuning in. This is Roberta Foster on the Author's Corner. Join me again next time.